Robert Mugabe, 1974 to 1990. Zimbabwe's president, Robert Mugabe, is often portrayed only as either a demon who destroyed Zimbabwe or the hero who liberated it. But perhaps by going back into history, we can actually understand how Robert Mugabe became the leader of the Southern African nation of Zimbabwe and how his party, ZANU-PF, became the powerhouse that it is today. Infighting within ZANU during the 1970s and criticism of the then-head Reverend Dabaningi Stole led to a series of assassinations and power struggles. Between 1964 and 1974, Mugabe spent his time in detention, and it was while he was in prison that Mugabe managed to take over the party in a 3-1 vote. Mugabe was released from prison in December 1974, a few days before the assassination of the former party chairman Herbert Chitepo. Mugabe secretly traveled to Mozambique during that time as well. Many leaders like Tanzania's Julius Nyerere and Mozambique's Samora Machel, and guerrilla leaders like Josiah Tongogara did not immediately accept his ascension to the head of the party. Mugabe's arrival in Mozambique created serious conflict between guerrillas who had been fighting and those who had been recently released from prison. Many young guerrillas were displaced due to conflict around tribal and ethnic lines, tactics and ideology. And in 1978, several guerrillas were ousted and arrested while in Mozambique, including those from the Zimbabwe People's Army, ZIPA. The ZIPA was made up of more than 40 other ZANLA commanders who drafted the Mgagawa Declaration. The Mgagawa Declaration of the 3rd of October 1975 stated that they would restart the war with a unified army, and that ZANU's president Dabaningi Stole had discredited himself, and that the next in line, Robert Mugabe, while unknown to the soldiers, was just below Sitole in the party's hierarchy, would step in. Training camp disputes in June 1976 between former ZIPRA and former ZANLA soldiers later resulted in casualties. However, in 1979, Mugabe had managed to restructure ZANU-PF and keep the guerrillas in check by making the military wing subordinate to the Central Committee, made up of mostly politicians, despite the real losses on the part of those doing the fighting. While most liberation soldiers received help from Mozambique and Zambia, Zimbabwean guerrilla forces also operated on a low level in Namibia and Botswana, and particularly in Mozambique. In September 1979, when the Lancaster House Agreement was signed, ZANU and ZAPU were facing pressure from Mozambique and Zambia to reach a settlement because of the economic toll of the war on their respective economies. Joshua Nkomo had better relations with Zambia, and the African Union, then the OAU, even the United Nations, while Bishop Muzerewa was still favored by South Africans. The British initially wanted to sideline Mugabe because of the guerrilla tactics used by ZANU's ZANLA forces. Even after the agreement was reached, many guerrillas did not go to assembly points, but stayed in the villages and were accused of intimidating people prior to the 1980 elections. Meanwhile, the British and the Smith regime colluded to frustrate ZANU by not offering public services that had been given to Muzorewa's organization and by allowing South African troops to remain in the country in breach of the Lancaster House Agreement. The election in 1980 reflected the seeds of tribalism sown in the military camps and in the negotiations. The majority Shona gave Mugabe 57 seats in parliament, while the Ndebele and Karanga, who were 19% of the population, gave Nkomo 20 seats. Muzerewa only secured 3 seats. Mugabe's belief and pursuit of a one-party state can be summarized in his belief that a multi-party state is a luxury a developing country cannot afford. In 1980, Mugabe inherited an economy heavily dependent on South Africa after Ian Smith's 1965 Unilateral Declaration of Independence, UDI. In 1980, the self-professed Marxist Mugabe rather accepted a mixed-sector economy with thousands of large white farms and mining ventures owned by foreign capital. Interestingly, he gave 2 influential economic posts to white citizens. Dennis Norman became the Minister of Agriculture, and David C. Smith took over Commerce and Industry. However, many financial pledges from donors at the Zimbabwe Conference on Reconstruction and Development, ZIMCORD, in March 1981 were never fulfilled and slowed Zimbabwe's early progress. In the early 1980s, Zimbabwe's economy had a relatively diversified export base, and the government's decision to restrict external borrowing after 1983 also strengthened their ability to withstand Western influences. During this time, many multinationals, especially from South Africa, also divested from Zimbabwe. After 1990, when Zimbabwe was unable to service its external debt to the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF), Mugabe was persuaded to implement economic reforms through a structural adjustment program. These reforms, very unpopular, included liberalization of the economy and privatization of government-controlled or government-owned companies, a drastic shift from the planned development strategy he had used since 1980. The reforms under ESAP, Economic Structural Adjustment Program, had disastrous consequences for the economy, such as continuous currency devaluation, wage declines, massive retrenchments, rising rates of unemployment, and widespread deindustrialization.